Hello, my name is Brett Bartlett, and this is my defense of The Great Divide of Early Healthcare Practitioners, an essay that was originally written for History 591, which was a course on science and technology. So what is this new research and why is it important? My research begins to explore the relationship between physicians and apothecaries. Now, granted, this is certainly not new research, but where my research differs from some of the past research that I was able to find and study is that mine really begins to explore it not just from the perspective or viewpoints of the apothecaries and the physicians, but it also begins to look at it more from the perspectives of the general public. So my process. First, my research began with Sarah Backhouse. In the beginning, I was really searching for things relating to the Great Fire of London. I was curious what kind of medicine would have been available to people that had either suffered injuries of burns or even just other people that were sick or injured that might need care or treatment. Coming across this work by Sarah Backhouse, which is The Reviving of the Physicians, the Aftermath of the Great Fire of London, that's when I started to realize that when the physicians were returning from basically fleeing the city during the Great Fire of London, they found that many of the apothecaries had kind of taken over their practices, taken over their business. It was the apothecaries who were actually treating the sick and injured after the Great Fire of London. This had me begin to search more about physicians and apothecaries, how they differed from one another, and what kind of services each provided. What was the discrepancy between them? Eventually, I came across and investigated William Rose and the case of William Rose. This case was a landmark case in which the physicians basically tried William Rose because of services he provided to a patient, John Seal. It really emphasizes the difference between the physicians and the apothecaries, and this would also eventually lead to the House of Lords overruling the physicians and basically deeming that apothecaries were also medical practitioners and should be considered doctors as well. From here, I've learned more about the Apothecaries Charter, which was something that the physicians helped the apothecaries to gain. And this was because the physicians did not like that the apothecaries were actually considered grocers and were under the Grocers Guild and the Grocers Charter. From here, I also learned more about the first pharmacopoeia and did some more readings about that. And eventually this led me to Physic Lies of Bleeding. Physic Lies of Bleeding was a play. So it's by a playwright known as Tho Brown. And I read through this several times before I started to realize that there was a question in the back of my mind about what was the public perception. I certainly saw that there was some humor in it, but in order to see humor, you have to know kind of what's going on, both in the play and in the general idea as to what is the play about. And the play is about the feud in many ways between the apothecaries and physicians. In order for the public to understand the humor of this, they had to understand what was happening in the feud between the apothecaries and the physicians. So I wanted to explore this new topic from this differing perspective. As I was reading through a lot of the secondary literature on physicians and apothecaries, I noticed that many of it explores this feud between the physicians and apothecaries, but it explores it from their own perspectives. How did the apothecaries think of it? How did the physicians think about it? What were the events that were happening between them to cause and further this feud? The research that I wanted to include the public perception, as well as the influences of each of the parties on that public perception. Both physicians and apothecaries were publishing things publicly, publishing works that were basically taking shots at one another. And I wanted to know, why was this, and how was this affecting the public's perception of the medical field as a whole? The secondary works that I was investigating, first in chronological order, is George Erdang. Now, George Erdang writes on the first English pharmacopoeia, and I want to be specific here because the actual first English pharmacopoeia that most people are referring to is from the 1860s. I think it's 1864. The English Pharmacopoeia that George Ordang is writing about and that I'm referring to is the English Pharmacopoeia of Londinius. And this was published in 1618. And what's interesting is that the apothecaries were actually required to adhere to this pharmacopoeia by writ of King James I. But this is really what George Ordang is writing about. It's about this English pharmacopoeia. It does provide some basis, though, for the beginning of the relationship between the apothecaries and the physicians, and how the physicians had control over what the apothecaries were doing in the very early aspects of their own charter, where the apothecaries are no longer under the Grocers Guild. Again, after this in chronological order is Owen Lloyd. And Owen Lloyd writes about the relationship and engages in the discussion of the harms that both the physicians and the apothecaries committed against one another. But the work is really focused on basically just their relationship between them. It doesn't include the public perception largely. Another is R.S. Roberts. R.S. Roberts is kind of a continuation in many ways of what Lloyd was writing about, but also includes barbers or surgeons in the general discussion. And this work also goes on to focus on the development of these separate trades and professions towards the idea of a general practice of medicine. So this is definitely going to include a lot of what was happening between the physicians and apothecaries, the decline of their relationship, and at the same time also how all these multiple relationships within medicine were building towards an idea of general practice or general practitioners in medicine. Harold J. Cook, on the other hand, delves into the specific surroundings of the William Rose case and what had happened between William Rose and John Seale. It goes into how this challenged the separation of the practices and ultimately led the House of Lords to overturning the lower court's decision, in this case, the lower court being the Royal College of Physicians, who had the rights to basically have the oversight over the apothecaries. This also leads to the recognition of the rights of apothecaries to be considered doctors or medical practitioners. I also wanted to point out that in my paper, I do refer to a Brown and Bryant's work, but this is really a medical textbook on medicinal herbs. However, the introduction does delve into the relationship of physicians and apothecaries. And I found that this was some great work about the overarching views between the two different disciplines. But aside from kind of setting up some of the basic information, it doesn't really explore the relationship much beyond that. It's kind of just a cursory, broader view or look. However, also Sarah Backhouse, and this is one of the more recent works, the most recent works. Sarah Backhouse addresses the struggle that physicians had upon returning to London after the Great Fire. As I mentioned, this was the work that really got me to start looking into this topic and the ideas here. It talks about how many of the people had to turn to and rely upon the apothecaries because the physicians in many cases were fleeing London during the Great Fire of London with the ruling elites, the upper class, the nobility. And so upon returning, they had found that the apothecaries had largely taken over their business practices. Excuse me. The research done in this paper explores the professional relationship both between the early apothecaries and physicians through their views, through their own views, but then it does delve into the general public's changing perceptions of each profession. Both from the kind of beginning that we really start to explore these public perceptions, which is after the Great Fire of London, where the apothecaries are viewed as sort of the ones that stuck around and were really helping the general public, and a negative opinion at that time towards the physicians because the physicians were viewed as fleeing with the nobility. To later, when we see a reverse of the public opinion, and we see through Tho Brown's play, that apothecaries are really recognized as being in many ways kind of cons that are upselling and charging and skimping on medicines while charging high prices for them. We can also see these changing views through the timeline. In 1618, we can see how the physicians are really working with the apothecaries to help them gain their own charter. And then, as I just mentioned, in the 1660s, after the Great Fire of London, we can see that the physicians are fleeing, the apothecaries are staying, and there's a real positive opinion, public opinion, for the apothecaries. In the 1670s, we are seeing more accusations from the physicians against the apothecaries, that the apothecaries are actively undermining their practice. And in the 1690s, the apothecaries seek public benefits. And this actually kind of starts to outrage the public too, because they're starting to see that the apothecaries are thinking more of who they are than the public thinks that they actually are. And by the 1700s, we actually see this case of William Rose tried by the Royal College of Physicians. Again, critical to my own research was the primary source document of Othello Brown, which was Physicalize of Bleeding. And this is that play that was performed for general audiences in 17th century London that makes a joke between the physicians and the apothecaries and their dispute. And it illustrates how the arguments of the infighting within this community, this medical community, were overflowing out into the public opinion. For my continued research, I really felt that I was limited due to time restrictions. I was never truly able to develop the end or the final conclusion of my theory. And that is essentially that I wanted to see, was this public opinion, this negative public opinion for the apothecaries at one time, for the physicians at another time, negatively impacting the health of the general public? Were they not seeking certain treatments or not provided certain treatments because of this negative public opinion? All right, thank you very much for your time today. I certainly appreciate it. Below is my contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions about my research.